So, how did the party of Lincoln and the abolitionists become the party of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump? And how did the party of Dixie become the party of the first Black president of the United States? You may have heard that there was an ideological switch that was flipped sometime around 1964, one that turned Republicans off to the fight for civil rights for minorities and made Democrats their new advocates, with Presidents Kennedy and Johnson leading the way. But it was a little more complicated and took far longer than that. After the Civil War, most African Americans voted Republican if they were allowed to vote at all. But in the wake of the Great Depression, FDR's New Deal policies started to win over a modest amount of Black voters and irritate even more Democrats. But when President Truman signed a 1948 executive order expanding civil rights and ending segregation in the military, Black voters again took notice and increasingly began to vote for Democratic candidates. And if more Black people were voting for Democrats, that meant they weren't voting for Republicans. The Dixiecrats, Southern, white, middle to upper class Democrats, were infuriated by the desegregation of the military. To make matters worse, it was ordered by a president from their own party. Governor Strom Thurmond from South Carolina, a vocal segregationist, was so mad that he left the Democratic Party altogether that year and created a political party of his own. Officially, this short-lived party was called the States' Rights Democratic Party, but they were commonly known by, you guessed it, the Dixiecrats. Thurmond was hoping that enough like-minded segregationists would leave the Democratic Party and join him, robbing Truman of the Democratic vote in the 1948 presidential election. So sure was everyone that Truman wouldn't get enough votes from Southern whites to win, and so close was the race that newspapers were sent out prematurely claiming a win for Republican candidate Thomas Dewey, when in fact, Truman had won. While the term would not be coined until many years later, the Southern strategy refers to the Republican Party's solution to the loss of Black voters throughout the middle of the 20th century. To survive, the Republican Party had to either win back more Black votes or win a new block of white voters. While the Southern white working class didn't always vote with the middle to upper class Dixiecrats, there were times when they were willing if it meant maintaining a social status above that of a Black man. And as long as African Americans remained disenfranchised, oppressed, and subordinate, no white man could fall to the very bottom of the social or economic ladder, because that rung was reserved for Blacks only, so long as they remained oppressed. Since they already had the votes of a decent percentage of working-class whites in the South, what if the Republican Party could come up with a strategy to unite them with the Confederate flag-waving Dixiecrats, creating one solid and reliable white voting bloc? Now, only if they could find a hot-button issue that crosses the boundaries of social class and income to fire up and unite as many Southern whites as possible. If only there were some political issue that previously had them all up in arms. So you see, the Southern strategy wasn't as much about the South becoming more Republican as it was about the Republican Party becoming more Southern. And you didn't even need to be a card-carrying white supremacist in order to buy into the deal either. In the minds of many, as long as you were someone who is willing to look the other way with segregation and discrimination of minorities, as long as it meant you could be reelected, this was something you could sign on to. The next big obstacle to the segregationist agenda was the highly consequential appointment of California Governor Earl Warren as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in 1953, followed by the landmark 1954 decision Brown v. Board of Education, in which the court ruled that segregation in public schools based solely on race was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This decision overturned the decades-long legal standard defined by the separate but equal doctrine, but this didn't mean the end of segregation overnight. The practice of racial segregation was so tightly woven into the fabric of American law and society that no single victory of litigation or legislation could make it magically disappear. Instead, the Brown decision was the first in a series of legal victories that we know today as the Civil Rights Movement. But on a more immediate and practical level, the Brown decision meant that a multitude of segregated schools would have to be integrated. But how? The following year, the courts provided a plan for every state to carry out the integration of their schools, quote, with all deliberate speed. When Strom Thurmond, who was no longer governor of South Carolina, heard about the Supreme Court mandate to integrate public schools, he flipped his lid. And so, he did what all fired-up politicians do when they are in between offices. He ran for office. But this time, federal office. Thurmond became a Republican United States Senator for South Carolina in 1954, a seat he occupied for 48 years until he retired at age 100, passing the reins to Senator Lindsey Graham in 2003. Thurmond dedicated himself to the fight against school integration and legislation having anything to do with civil rights. But back in the 50s, the president could still count on around 30 to 40% of the black vote. Black voters weren't yet a solid voting bloc. The two political parties still held fairly similar lukewarm views about segregation and civil rights. In fact, presidential candidates Nixon and Kennedy held very similar positions on civil rights throughout most of the 1960 presidential campaign. Neither really came out in significant support for one side or the other until just before the election when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was thrown into jail. The Kennedy team didn't think that they could win without a significant portion of the black vote, so a call was arranged between Kennedy and Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King. Afterward, a few more calls were arranged, and Dr. King was released from jail. When I look back at the pre-election polls and compare them to the actual election results, I'm convinced that Nixon would have won if Kennedy had not acted when he did. 1964 was a pivotal year in the Southern strategy. It was a presidential election year, the civil rights movement was in full force, and the long-awaited Civil Rights Act of 1964 had finally just passed. The growing faction of segregationists in the Republican Party convinced presidential candidate Barry Goldwater to oppose the Civil Rights Act, although he had supported civil rights legislation in the past. But he was not the brash segregationist troublemaker type that George Wallace, Joe McCarthy, or even Strom Thurmond were. He was a more politically correct, polished, toned-down, fiscal conservative type of Republican who claimed to be against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 simply because he thought it was a bad piece of legislation that was too expensive and too expansive. And honestly, this wasn't too far from the truth. Contrary to what some claim, Goldwater was more of a classical liberal than a modern conservative. In other words, while he wasn't a big fan of social liberalism, he was more fearful of its fiscal burden than its racial ones. To be even more frank, he was willing to wear the conservative hat, but he just wasn't willing to wear the hood, if you catch my drift. So he didn't garner the same kind of emotional support from Southern whites who wanted to hear the straight talk of the former Confederacy. They wanted candidates who shared their resentment and used their racist language, not coded dog whistles about states' rights. There was a reason the crowd went wild when George Wallace bellowed, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." But they didn't get that kind of candidate with Goldwater. And so Goldwater lost. But what Goldwater did manage to do is to cut the Republican vote from 30 to 40% from the previous elections to only 7%. For perspective, Richard Nixon got 32% of the black vote in 1960. The 1964 election was the last time the Democratic Party won the white vote in a presidential election, and the first time that the Republicans won Georgia. Going forward, the black vote in presidential elections would never again rise above 17%, and it fell to 3% in 2016. When Goldwater lost in 1964, and he didn't just lose a little, he lost worse than anyone since 1820. I imagine an angry Strom Thurmond sitting in a dark room somewhere muttering, "I told you so." Now remember, Thurmond had been advocating for candidates who could stir up white racial resentment in an effort to convince enough white Southerners to vote for Republicans in national elections. But they didn't listen to him, and they picked Goldwater, and look what happened. What Thurmond needed was a Republican version of George Wallace to rile up the white supremacists of the South while appeasing the more outwardly colorblind in the party, sometimes called Goldwater Republicans, who didn't want to appear impolite or associate with the uncouth behavior associated with lower-class whites. So he arranged a meeting to make a Faustian bargain with the only candidate he thought could learn to fill those shoes. The candidate who almost won the 1960 election, Richard Nixon. Contrary to popular opinion, Nixon had been a bit of a Goldwater Republican himself in the beginning of his political career. He was vice president to a fairly moderate Republican President Eisenhower in the 1950s, and he was said to have had a professional friendship with Dr. King during his service as VP. But when faced with a choice between political survival and political correctness, Nixon chose the former. And so Thurmond told Nixon what he needed to do. No more campaigning with black people like he did with Jackie Robinson back in 1960. Nixon was taught the coded race language of the Dixiecrats, starting with the one term that Thurmond named his short-lived political party after, states' rights, which meant support for segregation and opposition to civil rights. Years later, Ronald Reagan, the Elvis Presley of the Republicans, drove white crowds wild in the South when he would bellow from the podium, "I believe in states' rights," and the crowd would just go, "Ah!" They would just go wild. While some Republicans had a legitimate concern for the protection of states' rights, these crowds knew what he really meant. Reagan vocally opposed both the Federal Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act when he was governor of California during the 1960s. But by the time he was elected president in 1980, the solid red American South had learned to speak Republican. Since 1964, any presidential nominee for the Democratic Party needs to get some of the Southern white vote in order to win. Since that election, the only Democratic presidents who received enough of the Southern white vote to win the presidency were Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, both sons of the South, who were charming, who spoke with Southern accents that seemed to magically increase in conjunction with the number of Southerners in the audience, to their delight. The Southern strategy worked. Nixon won, but it was far from complete. Had he not been, and I'll use his term here, a crook, Nixon probably would have been a 2-term president. Instead, we got Jimmy Carter, probably the only Democrat at the time who could have charmed up so many Southern white votes. Carter's Southern charm and evangelical ties, plus Watergate, plus the bribery scandal with Vice President Spiro Agnew, plus discontent over the Vietnam War, all added up to just enough Southern whites to vote for a Democrat for president. Some for the last time. In 2008, just months before Barack Obama was elected President of the United States, the U.S. Census Bureau released a report projecting the white population in America will fall below 50% sometime between the years 2040 and 2050. The timeliness of this projection, coinciding with the election of the first Black president and a historical economic disaster, created the perfect conditions in which the Southern strategy could still thrive. But the Republican Party's decision to, once again, use the politics of race and resentment as a strategy to confront the reality of a declining party does not seem sustainable. Senator Lindsey Graham said it best when he publicly remarked that Republicans, quote, aren't generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term. This is because the white vote, the only lifeblood of the Republican Party, will be harder to win as the white population continues to shrink. Granted, the Republican Party has been especially successful in alleviating some of this problem through the frequent use of voter suppression in minority communities and the gerrymandering of congressional districts. But how long can these two tactics sustain a party whose membership size hovers around 24% of all registered voters? Now, that's a lot of white independents to have to scare up every election. So it seems inevitable, rational, mathematical even, to assume that the Republican Party will, at some point in the future, have no other choice but to appeal to the increasing non-white share of the electorate if they want to keep winning presidencies or future majorities in Congress. Right? After the 2012 presidential election, researchers began noticing that changing racial demographics were creating an electorate that was likely to favor the Democratic Party in the future. And this is interesting in retrospect because this is around the time the Republican Party started investing the majority of their efforts in white grievance rhetoric that by 2016 was far more successful than they ever imagined it would be. And it's not just those in favor of progressive agendas that have noticed this. Republicans have been aware of this fact for the better part of a century, as you just learned. So why isn't the Republican Party organization making an effort to win more non-white support? I can speak from experience that definitely not all Republicans are racists. There are and always have been great Americans in both parties. Americans who believe in the principles of our Constitution and our democracy. So, why not go for more minority votes? Well, it really isn't completely for a lack of trying. I've known candidates who have hired African American professionals to come in and teach them how to appeal to more minority voters without any measurable success. The truth is that it's not necessarily the things that Republicans are saying that steers minority voters away from them. Empirical research shows that it is Republican policies that minorities don't like, and not necessarily the politicians themselves. Not all voters are swayed by hyperbolic rhetoric. Some of them actually vote according to what politicians do rather than what they say. So, what are the political and social effects when American voters are made aware of these projected changes in the racial and ethnic demographics of the United States? Well, in controlled experiments, white respondents from across the ideological spectrum express an increased support for more extreme right-wing candidates, as well as policies that promote assimilative rather than multicultural ideology. A majority of white respondents also expressed significant concern that their racial group's societal status will decline when compared with that of racial minorities. They expressed fear that whites will no longer represent the prototypical American, as well as the concern that whites may lose their place at the top of the socioeconomic and political ladder. So, folks, it looks like white identity politics is actually an effective campaign strategy. Surprise, surprise. It works. So, as long as the underlying moral and ethical implications of this fact remain less important than winning, Republicans will likely continue to, in the words of Barry Goldwater, go hunting where the ducks are.